foreign countries needed to be screened by a doctor. And to make a long story short, it was a miracle that the four of us were included in the group that was to leave Bergen-Belsen, because my mother had been sick for some time, couldn't even get out of bed. And my father that day came back from work, and only later did we find out that he'd been badly beaten, and he was barely conscious and very weak. We made it to the train, and we couldn't believe it that the four of us were now on a train. It was a Red Cross train, not a cattle car train, to get out of this hell of Bergen-Belsen. But then 2 days later, my father passed away on the train. He just couldn't make it. And his remains were taken off the train in a small town in southern Germany. My mother and my brother and I had no choice but to continue the journey, and it was a big shock. I don't think my mother was even aware of what was happening to our family. And then 2 days later, we arrived in Switzerland, and my mother and my brother were taken to a hospital immediately. She was very, very ill, very sick, and my brother had frozen toes because he had outgrown his shoes, and we had what's called roll call every day, standing on a big square to be counted, often for hours. He had to cut the shoes so he could still wear them, cut the toe end out of his shoes, and so he had frostbite, and he couldn't walk anymore. So the two of them were hospitalized, and I had just turned 14 years old. I was separated from them, and along with other people from Bergen-Belsen, sent to a refugee camp in North Africa, in Algeria, because the war had not ended, and the Swiss were run over with refugees. They didn't want any more, so they just had to get rid of us quickly, and we ended up in North Africa. For several months, I had no contact with my mother and brother. I didn't know if they had survived, but then I think after 2 months, I received a telegram that they were recovering, and when the war ended in May, then we were able to correspond regularly. The hope was that we would be reunited either by my going back to Switzerland or their coming to the camp in North Africa, but none of that happened. And we were separated for 18 months until first I myself arrived in the United States, and then 6 months later, they were able to come. We had relatives in America, and they were willing to provide affidavits, which was a necessary document for people to be able to get a visa to come to the United States. And all of that took a lot of time. So I was in North Africa, again, almost 1 year, when I was able to board a ship that took me to Baltimore. And on Christmas Eve of 1945, I arrived in Baltimore. I lived with cousins of my mother in New York City until they arrived, my mother and my brother, the following summer. And eventually we were able to find housing to live together again as a family. Life was rough because we were penniless. Nazis had taken everything away from us. My mother had never worked before, and she had to do minimum wage work jobs. And my brother went to school. When my brother had got a job during the day and went to school at night, and I went to school during the day and did after-school jobs. And somehow we managed to pay the bills. And we felt extremely fortunate despite everything that had happened, because America then was, for us, the land of opportunities. I was able to go to college, even though we were penniless. I got a scholarship. I went to City College, which was tuition-free, and got a scholarship for other expenses. And my brother and my mother worked. And so he first finished high school and then went to City College at night. And after I graduated from college in New York City, went to graduate school, got a PhD in economics, and eventually we came here. Well, I met my husband in graduate school, and after we both got our PhDs, spent 3 years in Washington, D.C., where he had a postdoc at the National Institutes of Health, and I worked for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and then we both came here and got jobs at the University of Michigan, where we taught for more than 35 years before we retired. So,
what do you think has been the greatest challenge for you to overcome?
Well, of course, getting used to a new country, a new culture, learning a new language, going to school, and with a mother who was highly traumatized, having lost her parents, her husband, many other relatives. It was a challenge to build a new life, but I think for me always the biggest challenge has been losing my father at age